based on their actual alphabetical order. So for that, so since for characters and for doubles, we had this comparison operator. So for that, we would need to have a comparison operator that can check two strings now, because each string is now an element now, right? So some function that takes two strings and tells you whether one string is smaller or larger than the other, right? We need a comparison operator for this. We can't just ask just like, is Joe less than Sally? There is no, the less than operator does not work like that. So we need to have a function for that. Now there is a function for that, that is from the library, that is strcmp. Now in our strcmp function that we talked about, in that function, it only returns whether two strings are the same or not, and it just returns if they are not the same, it returns a false. If they are the same, it returns a true. But we do not need that, right? We need if one string is less than another string, right? So if I provide these two strings, Sally and Sam, it should compare Sally with the values of Sam. It sees that the first two values are the same, so it does not consider them, and then moves on to the third letter between L and M, and then tells you that whether L is less or M is less than the other character, right? So that is how we figured out if one string is less than or greater than the other string. So we need to have that function as well. Okay, so let's just, so we are not going to use the library function, but let's just start with the code, right? So our goal is to have this sort of, okay, so we first would need to declare this matrix. So let's first do that. Get mat, and how many are they? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so 5, and let's say at a maximum size of 20. So that is a set of strings. So 5 strings with a maximum column size of 20 and 5 rows, right? So then we can initialize this array by just the similar way of initializing matrices or integer matrices. We can just have double curly braces, but for this thing, we'll just have a set of strings within one curly bracket, right? So we'll have Joe, and we have Sally. So now I'm essentially initializing this matrix with a set of arrays, right? So Joe is a value for the first row or the first row array. Sally is the value is the value for the second row and the second array, and so on. So then we have Mark, we have Amelia, we have Sam. Right. So I've initialized this matrix with these values, with these 5 names. Okay. So now we would need a set of functions. So first things first, we would also be using the selection sort code here. But before that, let's write a function which would print out this matrix, right? So let's have void print strings that will take in a matrix and print out all the values of that matrix. So how do we pass a matrix to the to our function? We have char. The row values are not provided. However, the column values need to be provided when we are talking about matrices passed as parameters to functions. And then since we also need the rows, so rows. Okay. And so now we need to print out this particular block of values of this matrix, so that when I call print strings with the value of Matt and the number of rows as 5, it should print out the set of strings that we have. So remember that cout behaves differently when we are talking about character arrays, right? So for this, if this was an integer matrix, we would have to go through all the individual cells step by step, one by one, and print them out. So each row, then I would need to go for each row. I would also need to evaluate each column values and then print them out. But remember, cout can be used to print out an entire array or entire character array or an entire string with one call, right? So we will have a loop for each row, int I equals 0, I less than rows, and I plus plus, right? So that is for each row, and then we can just call cout. Otherwise, we would have required another loop if it was an integer array or integer matrix. But since this is a character array, we can just call character array to print out a particular row, right? We wanted to print out a particular row. So how do I get a row from this matrix? So the question is, how do I need to have something like ARR of I, but do I also need to provide the column element as well, or the column index as well? So would this get me a row, or would this be an error? Any guesses? So this would actually get me an entire row or the ith row of that matrix, right? So I can just print that and then just do an ENDL. So this would basically and should print out all the strings row by row. So if we run this code, so it basically prints out all the different string values that we had, and we are just using one single cout call, and ARRI becomes an entire identifier for an entire ith row. Okay. Okay, so now that printing is done, now let's talk about sorting it. Okay, so here's the sorting. So we'll just copy this particular code here. There are other sorting algorithms as well. We'll just use selection sort. That's a simple enough sorting algorithm. We have this, but remember that this is for integer arrays. And so we now need to modify this thing to make it work with strings or string arrays. So first things first, now this selection sort algorithm will not be taking a single array, it would be taking a character matrix. So char goes there, and also the same thing as printing out our array. So we have our set of columns provided and then the number of rows for this matrix, right? Well, let's keep that as a, okay. Now, well, we now need to make two or more changes, right? So first things first, this index is fine, this for loop is fine. This compares if two values. So initially this compared if two values or two elements of that array are less than or greater than, but now we need to do this thing for character arrays, right? So we need a comparison function to say if one string is smaller than the other. So we need a strcmp function here, and you also need a swap function, right? So initially our old swap elements swapped two individual elements in one array, but now we are not swapping two individual elements. We need to swap entire rows, right? We need to make sure that when we talk about swapping Joe with Amelia, or when Amelia comes to the first element here, we need to copy this entire row of Amelia and then swap it with the first element here, right? So that is Joe, that is the entire row there. So we need to have a swap row function, not a swap element function, right? So we also need that. Okay. So coming back, so first things first, we need a strcmp function that compares two strings, and second, that is we need a swap rows function that swaps entire rows. Okay. Okay, so what would that code look like? So let's first do the strcmp function. So an strcmp function, what should it do? Well, officially in C++, strcmp function provides you the difference between the first non-matching characters I mean, their ASCII difference between their first non-matching characters. So if we have Sally and Sam, strcmp would return to you the difference between L and M. So it essentially would do, so I see S and S both are same, move on. A and A both are same, move on. L and M both are different. And what does it do? It basically returns L minus M, right? Because essentially we are subtracting characters. So that means we are subtracting the ASCII values of those things. So whatever is the difference, that is returned. So that means that in this particular case, L is less than M. So the return value would be negative, right? So if one is smaller than the other, so first string Sally, second string Sam. If Sally is smaller than Sam, then it would return a negative value, right? So strcmp returns negative if str1 is smaller than str2, and the other way around, right? So if str1 is greater than str2, it returns the difference between the characters, so that becomes a positive number, right? So for example, if str1 is Sally and str2 is Sam, this would return, so str1 is Sally and str2 is Sam. So this returns a negative value, right? strcmp would return negative. If it was the other way around, on the other hand, so str2 is Sally and str1 is Sam, then this would return a positive number, right? Because it returns M minus L and then gives you a positive number. Okay, so str1 is smaller than str2, and we need to basically write this code. So we now need to have a function that returns an integer value, that is negative value or a positive value or 0 if they are the same, and essentially compare two individual strings and figure out the difference between those characters. So let's have that function. So it returns an integer type. Let's call that function strcmp. So I'm naming it underscore strcmp. Takes in two strings. So we have character str1, that's an array, and similarly we also have str2, that is also an array, and we also need a sized value. Well, we are going to loop until we do not find it, but let's have it fixed as the fixed size for our case is size equals to, so our case was size was 20, so let's have a default value for this. So that was a default parameter, right? So this gives you, so if I do not provide a size, then the size stays 20, otherwise it takes whatever value I provide. Okay, so now comparing two strings. So let's do that. For int I equals 0, I less than size, I plus plus. Now just take Sam and Sally as the example. So it starts off with S. So it finds the first set of characters that does not match. So in this case, M and L, and then returns their difference, right? So what do we need to check for? We can have an if condition that checks if str1 of I does not equal str2 of I. So this, in case of Sam and Sally, this would be the ith index for M and L. So the value of